ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, and citizens of the world, thank you for being here. Let me begin with a simple but urgent truth. No one is prepared for what's happening right now. We are living through a moment of profound change, yet our leaders, our institutions, and even our societies are caught flat-footed. And I must tell you, the stakes could not be higher. We are witnessing a global transformation, one that touches every dimension of our lives: politics, economics, technology, environment, and above all, the fragile peace that sustains humanity. The reality we must face is that the global order, as we have known it, is unraveling before our very eyes. And the pace of this change is faster than most care to admit. For much of the post-World War II era, the world revolved around a single dominant power that not only shaped the architecture of international institutions, but also imposed a vision of political, economic, and even cultural leadership. That dominance was so entrenched that many came to believe it was permanent. Yet history has a way of humbling those who think they can freeze it in time. What we are seeing today is not the sudden collapse of a system, but the culmination of decades of underlying shifts in economic power, technological innovation, demographic realities, and the strategic ambitions of rising nations. The center of gravity is moving, and what once seemed immovable is no longer holding steady. Consider this: in the early 1990s, when the Cold War ended, the United States stood at the zenith of global influence. It possessed unmatched military power, dominated financial markets, and projected cultural influence across the planet. Commentators even declared the end of history, suggesting liberal democracy under U.S. leadership had triumphed once and for all. Yet only 30 years later, that confidence looks more like hubris. The rise of China as a technological and economic powerhouse, India's emergence as a global actor, Russia's assertive return to the geopolitical stage, and the growing voice of the global South are rewriting the rules of power. What once was a unipolar world has become a multipolar arena, and in such an environment, old assumptions simply cannot hold. Here's the hard truth. The institutions designed for yesterday's balance of power are no longer capable of managing today's realities. The United Nations Security Council reflects the world of 1945, not the world of 2025. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank are still disproportionately controlled by Western powers, even as Asia, Africa, and Latin America drive much of global economic growth. The result is a dangerous disconnect between global governance and global reality. This disconnect breeds frustration, resentment, and a growing refusal among rising nations to play by rules they had no part in creating. It is precisely this gap between who holds power on paper and who holds power in practice that makes today's world so unstable. The hook here is not just that power is shifting, but that the old guard refuses to acknowledge it. The United States and its allies still speak as if they remain the unquestioned arbiters of global order, yet their ability to enforce this vision has diminished. Wars of choice, financial crisis, and failed promises of globalization have weakened credibility, leaving a vacuum that others are eager to fill. At the same time, the new centers of power are not seeking to replicate the old model, but to redefine it altogether. China pushes forward with its Belt and Road Initiative, building infrastructure and alliances across continents. India asserts its autonomy, refusing to be locked into rigid blocks. Russia challenges Western dominance in security affairs. And nations across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia demand recognition not as passive recipients of policies, but as architects of their own destinies. The unraveling of the global order is not merely a story of geopolitical rivalry, it is about the failure to adapt. Leaders in Washington, Brussels, and other Western capitals continue to talk of defending the rules-based order, but too few acknowledge that those rules were written in a different era. If the system does not adapt to represent the world as it is, rather than as it was, it will not be defended, it will be abandoned. Already, we see alliances forming outside the traditional Western framework. BRI-CS has expanded to include new members, signaling a desire for alternative platforms of cooperation. Regional organizations, once sidelined, are stepping into roles the global institutions have failed to fulfill. And bilateral ties between Beijing and Moscow, between New Delhi and capitals across Africa, between Latin America and Asia, are reshaping the connective tissue of world politics. The question we must ask is not whether the old order can be preserved, but whether a new one can be built before the current system collapses entirely. That is the true danger when power shifts faster than institutions can adapt, instability follows. History has shown this time and again, from the fall of empires to the outbreak of world wars. We are at another such turning point, one where denial is the most dangerous choice of all. To claim that the system is intact when in reality it is breaking is to walk blindly toward crisis. To admit the truth, however uncomfortable, is the first step toward crafting a more balanced, inclusive, and sustainable global framework. The unraveling global order is the greatest story of our time, one that will define the lives of billions. The world is no longer centered on one capital, one vision, or one ideology. It is being shaped by many actors, each with their own ambitions, strengths, and vulnerabilities. To pretend otherwise is to misread the present and risk the future. And while no one may be fully prepared for what is happening, ignoring it is no longer an option. The transformation is here, and whether we seize it with wisdom or squander it through arrogance will decide the path ahead. One of the most pressing realities of our time is that political leaders are behaving as though they are trapped in a world that no longer exists. They cling to old doctrines, old strategies, and outdated assumptions about power, even while the ground beneath them is shifting. This refusal to adapt is not just a matter of inertia, it is a profound failure of vision. Leaders continue to talk about defending the so-called rules-based international order, but those rules were written in an era of unchallenged dominance, and the world has moved far beyond that point. The tragedy is that while the realities of a multipolar world are already shaping events, policymakers are still rehearsing yesterday's lines as if the script has not changed. The result is a growing gap between rhetoric and reality, and in that gap lies instability, mistrust, and the risk of escalating conflict. Think of how often we hear the same language repeated year after year. Talk of defending democracy, preserving stability, promoting prosperity under the banner of the West. Yet these words sound increasingly hollow to audiences around the world. Uh, they ring hollow because people see the hypocrisy. They see interventions carried out in the name of democracy that left nations in ruins. They see financial systems designed to favor a small group of wealthy states while punishing weaker economies. They see promises of globalization that delivered inequality instead of shared prosperity. This dissonance between words and outcomes erodes credibility, and credibility, once lost, is not easily recovered. Here lies the hook. It is not that the world is turning against the West. It is that the West has failed to adjust to a reality it can no longer control. In Washington, in London, and in Brussels, strategies are still rooted in the Cold War mentality of containment and dominance. Nations are classified as allies or adversaries, friends or foes, based on outdated binaries that ignore the complexities of today's interconnected world. China is treated as a threat to be contained, Russia as an enemy to be weakened, and the global South as a bloc to be managed rather than engaged as equal partners. But the world is no longer so easily divided. Countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa refuse to be pulled into rigid alignments. They seek partnerships that serve their own interests, not someone else's strategy. Yet leaders in the West often react with frustration, accusing these nations of not choosing sides, when in fact, what they are doing is asserting independence in a multipolar reality. This refusal to accept multipolarity is dangerous because it blinds policymakers to opportunities for genuine cooperation. Instead of recognizing that rising powers bring with them the potential for new solutions to shared problems, leaders insist on viewing them as rivals in a zero-sum game. The climate crisis, pandemics, global financial instability, and technological disruption, none of these can be addressed by one power alone. And yet, even as these crises deepen, leaders fall back on the reflexes of military build-ups, trade wars, and sanctions, as if the tools of the last century can solve the challenges of this one. That illusion is not just naive, it is reckless. The hook, again, is clear history does not wait for those who refuse to evolve. While Western leaders hold on to yesterday's worldview, others are moving ahead with new alliances, new economic systems, and new political frameworks. The BRICS expansion, the growth of regional financial mechanisms outside of Western control, and the increasing integration of non-Western economies are not anomalies. They are signals of where the future is heading. But rather than adapting to this shift, many leaders dismiss it, insisting the old order is still intact. Denial has become a strategy, and denial is the most dangerous strategy of all. What makes this even more alarming is that the public is not blind to these failures. Citizens across the globe see leaders locked in power struggles while basic problems remain unresolved. They see elites arguing about spheres of influence while inequality grows, climate disasters intensify, and trust in institutions collapses. The disconnect between the priorities of leaders and the needs of people is widening, and that disconnection is breeding unrest. When leaders refuse to face reality, it is ordinary people who pay the price in lost jobs, in unstable currencies, in rising cost of living, and sometimes in lives lost to wars that never should have been fought. At this moment, what the world needs most is leadership that recognizes the world as it is, not as it once was. Leadership that has the humility to accept that no single nation can dictate the future alone, and the courage to build genuine cooperation with others. But too often, what we see instead is leadership stuck in the past, repeating the same narratives, deploying the same strategies, and expecting different results. It is not simply a failure of policy, it is a failure of imagination. And when imagination fails, crises only deepen. No one is prepared for what is happening, least of all those who continue to believe that yesterday's playbook will work tomorrow. The longer leaders cling to a world that has already passed, the more dangerous the future becomes. The world has entered a new chapter, but its leaders are still reading from the last one. The page has turned. The question is, Ulf, will they? We are living in an age where shocks arrive with increasing frequency and intensity, yet the very governments and institutions meant to safeguard society are woefully unprepared. The unsettling truth is that the crises we now face are not only predictable, they are inevitable consequences of a rapidly transforming world. And yet, our leaders behave as though we still have the luxury of time, as though incremental adjustments will suffice. They continue to play catch up with events that have already outrun them, and this failure of foresight is perhaps the greatest danger of all. The hook here is clear. The future is no longer on the horizon. It is at our doorstep, and still no one is ready. Take climate change, the most urgent example. Scientists have warned for decades of the cascading effects of rising temperatures, extreme weather events, and environmental degradation. And now, year after year, the warnings are no longer predictions, but lived realities. Floods, droughts, wildfires, and hurricanes devastate entire regions, displacing millions, destroying crops, and destabilizing economies. Yet, despite this mounting evidence, many governments act as if these crises are temporary disruptions rather than the new normal. Investments in resilience are postponed, international agreements watered down, and meaningful reforms blocked by short-term politics. The world has been given countless alarms, but it is still sleeping through the fire. Technology, too, is advancing faster than our ability to govern it responsibly. Artificial intelligence is transforming industries, reshaping the labor market, and even redefining warfare. Biotechnology carries both the promise of medical breakthroughs and the peril of misuse. Digital infrastructure underpins everything from banking to security, and yet it is vulnerable to cyber attacks that could cripple entire nations. Here is the hook. These are not hypothetical risks. They are unfolding in real time, but regulation, ethics, and oversight are decades behind. The gap between technological possibility and institutional readiness grows wider each day, and into that gap flows uncertainty and potential chaos. Financial systems are no better prepared. The global economy remains deeply interconnected, yet fragile. Supply chain disruptions during the pandemic revealed just how quickly shocks can cascade across continents. Inflationary pressures, debt crises in developing countries, and the persistent volatility of energy markets all highlight the precariousness of the system. Yet leaders continue to treat these issues as isolated rather than systemic, applying bandages to wounds that require surgery. Central banks and policymakers rely on outdated tools, while ordinary citizens feel the brunt through lost jobs, higher costs, and dwindling security. This mismatch between reality and response is a ticking time bomb. Geopolitical shocks compound the danger. Military confrontations and rivalries are re-emerging in regions that had long been considered stable. Tensions in Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, and the Middle East remind us that conflict remains a constant risk in a multipolar world. But here again, diplomacy lags behind escalation. Dialogue is often replaced by threats, sanctions, and militarization, as if force can provide stability in an age where complexity demands cooperation. The world is preparing for wars it should not fight, while leaving itself unprepared for crises it must confront together. What makes this unpreparedness so troubling is not only the scale of the threats, but their interconnectedness. A climate disaster triggers migration, which strains borders, which fuels political extremism. A financial shock undermines trust, which destabilizes governments, which sparks conflict. A cyber attack on infrastructure could paralyze health systems in the middle of a pandemic. These crises do not happen in isolation. They collide and amplify one another, yet leaders persist in treating them as separate files on a desk rather than parts of a single fragile system. This fragmented approach is not governance, it is denial. The hook that cannot be ignored is that societies themselves are becoming aware of this gap, and with awareness comes anger. Citizens see that those in power are not preparing adequately for the storms ahead, and the erosion of trust in governments, international organizations, and even science itself is growing. Oh, when institutions fail to protect people from predictable dangers, cynicism takes root, and with it, the potential for unrest. The cost of unpreparedness is not only measured in economic losses or environmental damage, but in the crumbling legitimacy of the very systems that hold societies together. If there is one lesson history has taught us, it is that crises expose the weakness of institutions more brutally than success ever does. The question is not whether shocks will come. They already are. The question is whether we will finally recognize that the pace of change demands a new kind of readiness. And yet, as of today, the world continues to drift unprepared for the very storms it has been warned about for decades. The alarms are ringing louder, but those who should be leading are still asleep at the wheel. The specter of rising tensions and the growing risk of conflict is one of the most sobering realities of our time. Around the world, we are witnessing confrontations that recall the darkest moments of the 20th century, yet with even greater stakes. For decades, people believed that large-scale war between major powers had become unthinkable, a relic of a bygone age. But history has returned with a vengeance. And once again, nations are maneuvering themselves toward confrontation rather than cooperation. The problem is not only the disputes themselves, but the failure of diplomacy, the erosion of trust, and the dangerous illusion that military force can substitute for political wisdom. The hook is undeniable. The world is stumbling toward crisis it cannot afford, and the path we are on is perilously close to disaster. In Europe, the conflict in Ukraine has become a symbol of how fragile peace really is. What began as a regional dispute has evolved into a confrontation between great powers, drawing in NATO, Russia, and beyond. Billions of dollars in weapons flow into the battlefield, but peace talks remain scarce and half-hearted. Leaders insist they are defending principles, but the result is a protracted war with mounting casualties, devastated infrastructure, and a continent trapped in uncertainty. It is a chilling reminder that once violence escalates, it takes on a logic of its own, consuming resources, attention, and human lives. Yet what is missing is the courage to recognize that wars end not through escalation, but through negotiation. And every day that this is ignored, the risk grows that the conflict will expand beyond control. The South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait represent another flashpoint where rhetoric and militarization have overtaken dialogue. Here lies the hook the world's two largest economies. The United States and China are edging closer to confrontation, not because they must, but because they cannot imagine a framework of coexistence. Naval exercises, military flyovers, and increasingly hostile rhetoric create an atmosphere where even an accident could spark catastrophe. The parallels to previous eras of great power rivalry are striking, but the difference is that the consequences today would ripple through an interconnected world economy instantly, disrupting supply chains, financial markets, and everyday life on a scale never seen before. Yet instead of working tirelessly to diffuse tensions, policymakers continue to indulge in brinkmanship, convinced that shows of strength will guarantee stability. In reality, such shows only deepen mistrust. The Middle East, long a crucible of geopolitical rivalry, remains volatile as well. Regional powers jockey for influence, outside actors intervene, and conflicts simmer just below the surface. The world has seen decades of war in this region, yet it seems to have learned few lessons. The persistence of proxy wars, the entrenchment of sectarian divides, and the absence of comprehensive diplomacy mean that instability continues to fester. Each new crisis fuels migration, radicalization, and despair, and yet the same failed approaches, military intervention, short-term alliances, transactional deals, are repeated as though they will somehow succeed this time. Here, two, the absence of a serious commitment to dialogue perpetuates the cycle. What makes the present moment especially dangerous is that these conflicts are unfolding simultaneously, with each reinforcing the other. Rivalries in one region embolden hardliners in another, creating a global atmosphere where confrontation feels inevitable. Add to this the proliferation of advanced weapons, nuclear arsenals being modernized, cyber weapons capable of disabling entire societies, artificial intelligence integrated into military systems, and the risks multiply exponentially. A mistake, a miscalculation, or even a technical malfunction could set off a chain reaction that no one can stop. We live in a world where the margin for error has grown thinner, but the recklessness of decisions has only increased. The deeper issue is the collapse of diplomacy. The art of negotiation, compromise, and patient dialogue has been sidelined by the politics of posturing. Leaders now view talking with adversaries as weakness rather than necessity. But history tells us the opposite. Diplomacy is not weakness. It is the only alternative to ruin. When the Cuban Missile Crisis threatened to bring the world to the brink of nuclear war, it was not weapons but words that prevented catastrophe. Today, however, the mechanisms for dialogue are neglected, the trust needed to sustain them is absent, and the forums designed to resolve disputes are paralyzed. International institutions are unable to function as intended, leaving nations to resort to unilateral actions that escalate rather than resolve. The hook, perhaps the most unsettling one, is that public opinion is being conditioned to accept war as normal. In many societies, media narratives fuel the idea that confrontation is unavoidable, that rivals are enemies, and that military spending is the only path to safety. This mindset dulls resistance to war, making escalation more politically feasible. Yet, what is truly inevitable is the destruction and suffering that follows conflict. To normalize the drumbeat of war is to forget the lessons of the 20th century, the millions lost in two world wars, the devastation of cities, the collapse of civilizations. To walk this path again with even more destructive weapons at our disposal is to risk a calamity beyond imagination. The world stands at a crossroads. Either we rediscover the discipline of diplomacy and the humility of coexistence, or we will allow ourselves to be swept into conflicts that no one can control and everyone will regret. The rising tensions are not abstract. They are real, visible, and escalating, but they are not destiny. What makes them dangerous is not that they exist, but that leaders refuse to confront them with the seriousness and responsibility they demand. The tragedy is that the warnings are already here, the lessons of history already written, and yet the choices being made echo the very mistakes that once plunged humanity into catastrophe. Across continents, there is a growing disillusionment among citizens who feel abandoned by the very institutions and leaders who promised stability, prosperity, and fairness. From Washington to Berlin, from Lagos to Sao Paulo, the same refrain can be heard. The system is not working for ordinary people. This is not a localized sentiment. It is a global phenomenon cutting across cultures and political systems. People sense that the grand promises of globalization, democracy, and development have too often translated into widening inequality, persistent corruption, endless wars, and declining trust. The hook is unmistakable. The legitimacy of governance itself is unraveling, and societies are beginning to question whether those in power are serving the public good or merely their own narrow interests. In advanced economies, citizens see widening wealth gaps as the defining feature of their societies. The top 1% accumulate unimaginable fortunes while wages for ordinary workers stagnate. Housing becomes unaffordable, healthcare increasingly inaccessible, and education a privilege rather than a right. Politicians campaign on promises of reform, yet once in power, little changes. The sense of betrayal is palpable, leading to populist backlashes, rising polarization, and the erosion of democratic norms. Voter turnout declines, cynicism grows, and the belief that change can come through conventional political processes fades. This is not apathy, it is a rational response to a system that no longer delivers. In developing countries, the disillusionment takes another form. Citizens there often see governments that collude with global elites, borrowing heavily from international financial institutions, only to impose austerity measures that hurt the poor while enriching a small elite. The dream of progress through globalization has soared into a nightmare of debt dependency, capital flight, and social unrest. Entire generations feel that the promise of opportunity has been stolen, and with it, the hope of stability. The hook here is stark. When trust in national governments collapses, people turn to the streets, to radical movements, or to despair, each of which undermines social order. Wars and endless military engagements have also fueled the sense of betrayal. In the United States and Europe, citizens were told that interventions abroad would bring security, democracy, and prosperity. Instead, they watched as wars dragged on for decades, costing trillions, taking countless lives, and yielding little but instability. At home, the same government struggled to fund healthcare, infrastructure, or education. People naturally ask, how can there always be money for war, but never enough to fix the problems in our neighborhoods? This hypocrisy has left scars on the political landscape, where promises of responsible leadership are met with skepticism and anger. The erosion of trust is not confined to politics. It extends to media, corporations, and even science. Citizens are bombarded with misinformation and propaganda, often pushed by the very outlets once trusted to provide clarity. Corporate scandals reveal how profit is often prioritized over public safety, as seen in environmental disasters or pharmaceutical crises. Even scientific guidance, essential in moments of crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic, has been politicized, leaving people uncertain about who or what to believe. This collapse of trust is corrosive because once skepticism becomes entrenched, even genuine attempts at reform are met with suspicion. The hook that cannot be ignored is that this disillusionment creates fertile ground for extremes. When people lose faith in mainstream politics, they turn to populists, demagogues, or authoritarian figures who promise simple solutions to complex problems. Across the globe, we see the rise of strongman leaders who thrive on anger and discontent, presenting themselves as the only alternative to a broken system. Yet these figures often deepen the very problems they claim to solve, eroding freedoms, dismantling institutions, and polarizing societies even further. the cycle becomes vicious. The more people feel betrayed, the more they embrace extremes, and the more fragile democracy becomes. At the same time, movements from below are emerging, driven by young people who refuse to accept a broken status quo. Protests over climate change, racial justice, women's rights, and economic inequality erupt across capitals, signaling that citizens are not willing to remain silent. These movements are a double-edged sword. They reflect a healthy demand for accountability, but also highlight the failure of established politics to address urgent issues. When the streets become the arena of last resort, it means the institutions designed to channel voices and solve problems are no longer trusted. That is a crisis of governance at its core. The global disillusionment is also reshaping geopolitics. The global South, long sidelined in international decision making, is asserting itself with new confidence. Nations that once followed Western dictates now demand fairer treatment and greater respect. Their citizens are no longer content to be passive recipients of aid or lectures from abroad. They demand a seat at the table, and their discontent fuels a shift in alliances and loyalties. This is not merely a regional trend. It is part of a global reckoning with the failures of elites to deliver on decades of promises. The deeper danger is that this widespread disillusionment is eroding the glue that holds societies together: trust. Without trust, governance becomes a hollow exercise, laws lose legitimacy, and institutions lose authority. Once trust collapses, rebuilding it is far more difficult than sustaining it. The world now finds itself in precisely this dangerous terrain where citizens doubt not only their leaders, but the very systems designed to serve them. And when trust vanishes, societies do not drift gently, they fracture, often violently. The hook is sobering but necessary. When people feel betrayed long enough, they will either withdraw completely from the system or seek to tear it down. Neither path leads to stability. What is required is a reckoning, an honest recognition by those in power that their legitimacy cannot rest on empty words, but on tangible results. Until then, disillusionment will continue to grow, reshaping politics, destabilizing nations, and challenging the very idea of governance itself. Survival in this new era will not depend on holding tighter to the illusions of the past, but on preparing wisely for the realities of the present. Preparation is not a luxury. It is the dividing line between societies that endure and those that collapse. Yet preparation requires something that has become scarce among global leaders: humility, foresight, and the willingness to change course. The hook that should shake us is this: our world is moving into a multipolar order, whether we are ready or not, and the refusal to adapt will only magnify the crises that already threaten our future. Preparation begins with diplomacy, because no nation can navigate today's challenges alone. Yet too often, diplomacy has been treated as an afterthought, overshadowed by militarism and economic coercion. True preparation means returning to the discipline of dialogue, building mechanisms to diffuse conflicts before they spiral out of control. It means acknowledging that adversaries do not vanish because we declare them illegitimate. and that coexistence is not weakness, but necessity in a world armed with nuclear weapons, cyber capabilities, and artificial intelligence-driven warfare. The margin for error is perilously thin. To believe that force can substitute for negotiation is not just outdated, it is suicidal. Preparation also demands fairness. For decades, globalization has been sold as a rising tide that would lift all boats, but in reality, it lifted a few yachts while leaving millions stranded. Inequality within and between nations has become the defining feature of our age. If the global system continues to favor the powerful while exploiting the vulnerable, instability will only deepen. Fairness requires reforming international institutions so that they reflect the realities of today, not the power balances of 1945. It requires ensuring that nations of the global South are not perpetual spectators, but equal participants in shaping solutions. The hook here is urgent. If the system does not bend toward fairness, it will eventually break under the weight of resentment and defiance. Sustainability must also be at the core of preparation. Our economies still run on extractive models that devour resources, poison the planet, and mortgage the future. Climate change is not a distant threat, but a present reality reshaping weather, agriculture, and livelihoods. To continue on the current trajectory is to guarantee a world of climate refugees, food insecurity, and social collapse. Preparation means accelerating the transition to clean energy, protecting ecosystems, and investing in technologies that respect planetary boundaries. The choice is stark, adapt sustainably now, or face catastrophic adjustments later. That will be far more painful and far less orderly. The hook that resonates most deeply is that humanity's future is shared, whether we acknowledge it or not. Pandemics do not respect borders, nor do rising seas, cyber attacks, or financial crises. The illusion that any nation can wall itself off from global challenges has been shattered time and again. Yet leaders still cling to nationalism as though it were a shield. Preparation requires a shift in mindset from zero, some competition to shared responsibility. This does not mean abandoning national interests. It means recognizing that in a tightly interdependent world, national interests cannot be secured without cooperation. To prepare also means investing in people. Education, healthcare, and social protections are not secondary to security. They are its foundation. A population that feels abandoned, disillusioned, or excluded becomes fertile ground for instability. A society that equips its citizens with skills, dignity, and hope becomes resilient. Yet across the globe, leaders pour resources into weapons while neglecting the basic needs of their people. This imbalance is unsustainable, and the hook is devastatingly clear. No arsenal can protect a government that has lost the trust of its citizens. No one is prepared for what is happening, but that does not mean preparation is impossible. It means that the window to act is rapidly closing. Every delay, every denial, every refusal to adapt narrows the options and raises the costs. The future will not wait for leaders to catch up. It is already here. The question is whether humanity will meet it with vision and courage, or whether it will stumble forward unprepared, repeating mistakes that history has already shown us to be catastrophic. The pen is in our hands and the page